Postdoc at the Center for Addictions Research here at UVic, and I just finished my PhD here also at UVic. So I've been at UVic for quite some time, working with the Center for Addictions Research and primarily in the area of adolescent substance use and the trajectory of substance use over time and how that relates to things like attendance at post-secondary education and things like that. So today, I'm talking about some of my own research, some which was from my PhD and some that I've done since then, looking at factors that affect the relationship between alcohol use and post-secondary education. So how many of you have heard of the term emerging adulthood? Yeah. So we often use the term emerging adulthood to refer to young adults, basically. Young adults is equivalent to emerging adults. It's basically age 18 to 24 approximately. And we've only in the last decade really acknowledged that this developmental period is one that's maybe distinct from other developmental periods like adolescence and adulthood. And the thing that makes it distinct is that it really become a period of exploration and instability for this group. So instead of transitioning into parenthood and workforce and marriage earlier in their early 20s, we often delay that now till late 20s. And so it's really changed the dynamic of this emerging adulthood period. And what we have seen about this period, or something that's distinct about this period, is it's when alcohol use is very, very common and for many considered relatively normative. So a recent study that was done by the Center for Addiction Research found that about 43% of young adults between 19 and 24 exceed the low-risk drinking guidelines. So, and that 90% of the alcohol they consume is consumed in ways that increase the risk for long or short-term harm. So not only are they drinking a lot, but they're drinking in patterns that increase their likelihood of harm. When we think about what actually happens to substance use as we develop, this is basically the normative trend of alcohol use over time. So basically we have an onset of alcohol use between ages 14, 15. We see steep increases that peak about 21 and then decline. And it'll continue to kind of decline through through adulthood. It'll stabilize a bit. And accompanying this trend and accompanying the high drinking rates of young adults are lots of problems. So we have high rates of alcohol poisoning, high rates of injuries particularly, and lots of other risk behaviors such as engaging in high-risk sexual behavior, drinking and driving, those types of things. How many of you have heard of neck nomination? So you've all heard of this crazy drinking trend. So yeah, so basically the neck nomination is just an example of kind of one of the drinking trends that occur in this population. So it's an online social drinking game where people basically consume excessively large amounts of alcohol, often while doing crazy stuff like drinking it out of a tit. And then they post it on social media and nominate two of their peers to outdo them, essentially. And this is something that has basically swept the globe in the last few months. And so these kind of fads or trends that occur can be particularly dangerous among this population. One of the things, though, I think is important to ask when we're thinking about drinking during this developmental period is whether alcohol use is actually a college-specific issue. How many here would think of drinking as a college-specific problem? Anybody? We often talk about alcohol use as a college issue. And when I say that, I mean that we hear all about the drinking that happens on college campuses, and we never hear about drinking among non-students. And some research basically says that, yes, alcohol is actually a college issue. And I'll show you this graph, which comes from the United States. It comes from a very large national survey that's been conducted every year since 1975. It's called the Monitoring the Future study. And they consistently find this relationship. So what you're looking at here is what alcohol use looks like for college students. And this is what alcohol looks like for non-college students. And the trend that they consistently find is that at about end of high school, college students don't drink as much. So kids that are going to go on to college aren't drinking as much as those that don't go on to college. But then the college students actually increase and surpass the levels of non-college students, and then again they kind of even out towards the end of early adulthood. And so it's findings like this have really perpetuated the idea that drinking is a college problem, that these are the young adults that we need to be concerned about. So we're going to explore this issue a little bit further, but I want to show you first some statistics about alcohol use right on UVic campus. So in spring 2013, so last spring, for the first time in Canada, we conducted the National College Health Assessment Survey, and 32 universities and colleges across the country participated in this survey, and it was a health survey, so it asked all about students' mental health, their academic stressors, their sexual health, their alcohol use and substance use, and a whole bunch of things. And UVic participated in this study. So for the last 6 months, I've been working with the team of researchers to get a kind of a profile of what students are doing on campus. So this is based on 1,500 UVic students who responded to the survey. And basically we found that UVic students were drinking on average 3 to 5 times a month, so on average once a week. When they were drinking, females were drinking on average 4 drinks per occasion and males 5 drinks per occasion. Now the low-risk drinking guidelines say that to reduce your likelihood of injury, so like really acute harms, that females should not consume more than 3 drinks per occasion and males not more than 4. So what that ended up being was about 50% of students had exceeded the low-risk drinking guidelines on their last drinking occasion. When we look at binge drinking, which is kind of the drinking pattern we're most often concerned about, so that when we talk about binging, we're talking about 5 or more drinks in a single setting. That's how it's been defined in the literature. And about 39% of students had exceeded or had binge drank at least once in the last 2 weeks. So, these drinking patterns are basically consistent with what we've seen, that this population drinks at high levels and they're in risky patterns generally. And so it's not surprising in some ways that we think of post-secondary students as being particularly at risk, because going to post-secondary education really immerses this population in a group of same-age peers. They are immersed in an environment that is relatively tolerant to alcohol use and are really motivated by the belief that this time in their life, this college years, are meant as a time of exploration and experimentation. And so all those kind of beliefs and motivations and contextual environment kind of feed drinking among this population. What we don't know. So we know that college students drink a lot. We don't know very much about non-students. So that's one thing we don't know. The other thing that we haven't really paid much attention to is the fact that post-secondary education is a diverse experience. So we often talk about students and non-students, but actually the experience of post-secondary education is very diverse. So students or young adults can choose different types of institutions. They can choose different degrees within their institution. They can drop out, re-enroll, or switch institutions. They vary in the timing of enrollment, the timing of completion, and they also engage in lots of other things at the same time, like part-time work, becoming a partner, or a parent. And so all that diversity really can influence the relationship between alcohol use and post-secondary education, and we know almost nothing about it. The final thing that we don't know is what happens to Canadian young adults. So 99.7% of the literature is American, so on what we know about college drinking. And that creates a problem for us because there are lots of things that are going to influence this relationship, including substance use policies and the educational structure of the educational system. So policies such as the legal drinking age, which is 2 years higher down there, could really be a problem for generalizing the findings from those studies. What I'm going to share with you is 2 studies that I have been working on, the results from 2 studies, that look at some of this diversity in educational experiences of young adults and how that diversity relates to to substance use. So what we know about Canadian young adults is about 80% between ages 18 and 26 attend some type of post-secondary education during emerging adulthood. How many of those do you think attend university? Want to take a guess? Third of them? 20%? It's 50%. So 50% attend a university. About 33% will attend a college, like a 2-year college. 17% will attend some sort of technical or private institute. And then 8% will attend more than one institution. So they move between colleges and universities and technical institutes. Something that previously hasn't been examined is how timing matters. So for a long time, I think it's been assumed that people, go to post-secondary education out of high school, and that was the trend a couple decades ago. But in the last decade, we've really moved away from that, and students are more likely to take time off between enrolling in post-secondary education. And you hear people say, well, don't just go to post-secondary education. It's really expensive. Like, figure out what you want to do, then go. But we don't really know what that means in terms of outcomes. Basically, about 50% of students will go within 3 months of from leaving high school. By a year later, 75% will have gone, and within 2 years, 81% will have gone. And then the rest kind of trickle in after that. So I looked at these two things in relationship to substance use. And everything that I've been working on comes from a very local sample. So it's very relevant to BC and Victoria specifically. So this Victoria Healthy Youth Survey, has anyone heard of the Victoria Healthy Youth Survey? So this was a study that was started in 2003, and it's a collaborative project between a bunch of researchers here at UVic. And in 2003, we did a random community sample of youth between 12 and 18 in the greater Victoria area. And we've now followed them for 6 waves, and we're currently doing our 6th wave of data collection now. So we've been able to follow them from the time they were 12 up to, well, they'll be 30 by the time we finish collecting the 6th wave. Some of them will be 30, not all of them. And so this has really allowed us to see what's happening over time and understand how transitioning into post-secondary education, for example, will alter your trajectory of substance use. That's not what I want to show you. So,
a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Can you explain the difference between the high school group again and the university group? The high school group, they
don't attend any post-secondary education. Yeah. For lots of reasons. I mean, you have to think about when you have high levels of substance use in adolescence, it often closes off pathways to pursue post-secondary education in the first place because you have lower grades, which makes it more difficult to get into certain institutions. So one of the things that I wanted to know is why are these group differences exist, right? So we have to account for the fact that people choose different types of institutions based on a match for them. So it's probable that there's actual different characteristics about the young adults that attend different types of institutions that are making these differences. So I went and I explored, well, if I count for high school grades, does that make a difference? If I account for socioeconomic status, because college is cheaper, right? Then does that make a difference? Does it make a difference if I count for sex or the gender differences? What about living arrangements? If you live with your parents versus move out to live off campus, does that make a difference? After accounting for all those things, nothing disappeared. Everything was exactly the same. And I couldn't figure out why 2-year college students would be different from university students. What makes them higher? So the one last thing that I accounted for, which made all the difference, was age at the time they enrolled. So as soon as you account for how old students are when they enrolled, this is what you get. No differences at all. The high school group doesn't have an age of enrollment, so they still look the same. So what it meant was that the 2-year college students had higher levels of consumption simply because they tended to be older when they enrolled. They weren't coming right out of high school. They were taking time off, and then they would go enroll in college. And when you accounted for that, there was no longer any differences. So what does that really mean? Does it mean that the type of institution you go to doesn't actually matter? So I have a few things to say about that. First I just want to say that contrast to the first graph I showed you that showed that college students surpass their non-student peers, that does not seem to be the case here. That these non-student young adults are a very at-risk population that is very difficult to reach, and that we have largely ignored them in the literature. So something to point out. Second, enrollment in post-secondary education does increase alcohol use, but that increase is conditional on age, not really on where you go. And so younger students tend to have increases in their consumption more than older students. And it never exceeds non-student peers. One thing that's important to point out, though, I think, is that despite having similar increases, it doesn't mean the reason for those increases are the same across institutions. And I think that's important to remember. So we often, at universities, consider resident students to be a very high-risk group. The idea that the contextual environment of living in residence facilitates excessive alcohol consumption. If that does play a factor in increasing alcohol use among those students, it cannot be a factor for increasing alcohol use among students at two-year colleges because they don't live in residence. So those factors are still important because how we engage in prevention and intervention initiatives with students relies on us being able to understand how we can target them. And residence will not be an option for college students, just as an example. Okay, so quickly just showing you the results of my second study. So based on that first study, I was really surprised by the age thing. I was like, okay, wow, this timing thing, how old you are when you enroll seems to kind of really matter, but no one's actually looked at it or even controlled for it before. So I instead wanted to see how timing really matters. So I divided my sample into 3 groups. We have those that go on time, those that we consider to be a normative transition, but 55% will enroll right after high school. We have those that take a gap year. We don't know why they take a gap year, but travel, work, whatever, they take a year off. It's about 24%. And then a delay group who take more than a year, but on average take 2 years. Most of them have gone by the age of 21. Okay, so this is what the trajectory of alcohol use looks like before and after each of these groups of young adults enroll. So if you look at the on-time group, these lines denote when they enroll. Okay, so for the yellow group, these are those that go on time. They have steep increases. They go to post-secondary education at this yellow line. They keep increasing, peak, and then start to come down. The gap year, they're increasing, but they kind of almost peak when they go. They keep going a bit of an increase, but not very much, and start to decline as well. And then the delay group looks very different. So first you'll notice they have higher levels going in, like their slope is quite different. They kind of have these high levels up here. But as soon as they go, their consumption starts coming down. So the idea that post-secondary education increases your alcohol use is only true of students that enroll in right out of high school. And so really pointing to the idea that the effect of post-secondary education is conditional on how old you are when you enroll. So what do we kind of do with this and what do we take away from it? I think one of the first things is just to acknowledge that diversity is important in terms of understanding these relationships and that the needs of students may be different depending on their pathway, on their educational path. And provides us some opportunity to say that in terms of targeting prevention and intervention efforts in post-secondary education gives us a bit of an idea of who would be most at risk. We know young adults not attending post-secondary education are an important but understudied group, and that strategies should optimally target those coming directly from high school. But what I do want to is this idea that alcohol use is a college-specific issue or a time-of-life issue. Based on what I showed you in my results, what do you think alcohol use is? Time of life? Yeah. I personally think that alcohol use is not a college issue. I think it's a time of life issue, and I think our data supports that. I want to show you this because basically is, I'm going to overlay all the graphs I had. So this is general population trends, increase, peak 21, decline. This is what happens when you account for all the differences between post-secondary groups. All you see is the same thing, increase, peak 21, decline. This is when you plot it by age of enrollment. All you see the exact same pattern. You just increase, peak, decline. The reason that 18-year-olds, when they go to post-secondary education, increase in their consumption is because they haven't reached their peak yet. They're furthest from it. Their developmental trend is, they're simply further back in their developmental trend than those that go out later. So what does that mean if it's not a college issue and it is a time of life issue? I think to me, what it means is that when we consider prevention and intervention efforts in university settings, that it's important to consider development. That's important to consider developmental theory and the things that we understand about this period of development, rather than the idea that it's residence is the cause, that that there's things that the university is doing wrong that are the cause, that we actually go more towards developmental theory and think about what it means to increase substance use for that young group, and integrate those types of things into our prevention programs.